And again, thank you for joining us for this Cover Crops and Gardens webinar. So today, what we're going to talk about is several things, and I just wanted to show some of the things that we are going to cover in today's session. We're going to talk a little bit about soil health, and I know a lot of you that are probably listening are very well versed in soil health and gardening, but I do want to cover some of the basics of that. I also want to touch on the importance of organic matter in soils and how vital that is to soil productivity and overall soil health. Another aspect of soil health that I want to talk about is mycorrhizal fungi. Again, some of you may be familiar with that, but I want to talk a little bit describing what that mycorrhizal fungi is and how it works in conjunction with plant roots as a benefit. So it's another vital component for soil health. Then we'll get into the meat of the discussion, which is talking about cover crops and gardens. What are the benefits of this in terms of decreasing soil erosion, increasing the organic matter content in the soils, increasing the mycorrhizal fungi in the soils? And then we'll have questions at the end. So to start off with, and for some of you that maybe are master gardeners or master naturalists, some of these slides you may have already seen, but I do want to cover some of the basics of this to start off. Most of those minerals are going to be plant nutrients. You'd want about a fourth of that volume be made up of air or gases, things that we typically don't think about being in the soil. So when you're thinking about those little pores in the soil or earthworm channels, for example, it's not empty space, it's filled up with gases or air. You'd want about another fourth of that volume be made up of water. And then the remaining amount, about 5%, be made up of organic matter. That would be an ideal composition by volume. If you would have looked at our soils in the Midwest about 200 years ago, we would have been very close to that ideal composition, especially on the mineral and the organic matter side. A lot of our soils in the Midwest had anywhere from about 4 to maybe 8% organic matter, just incredible amounts of organic matter in our soils, very large mineral content. We would have been a little bit high on the water side in the soil, a little bit low on the air side. But again, very close to that ideal composition 200 years ago. When you look at that percentage for organic matter and you think, well, it's only 5%, it must not be that important. But organic matter is incredibly important for soils. So many benefits that it provides. One of them is as that organic matter continues to decompose, it releases nutrients, plant nutrients into the soil that plants can take back up. It also helps make the soil looser. So it allows roots to move through that soil more readily, allows water to move through that soil more readily. Another thing that organic matter does is it increases the soil's capability to hold water that plants can get to. Just because the soil has water in it doesn't always mean that water is available for plants to be able to use. But the more organic matter you have in the soil, the more plant available water you're going to have. And another big benefit of organic matter is it allows that soil to hold nutrients in the root zone. So in other words, for example, if you added a fertilizer to a soil that has a lot of organic matter in it, it's going to hold those nutrients from that fertilizer in place so it doesn't leach below the root zone. Now, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, a lot of our soils in the Midwest had huge amounts of organic matter in them, 4 to 8%. If you look at other parts of the world, you would see that most of those soils have little or no organic matter in them. So how did we get all of that organic matter in place? Well, it was from what was naturally growing on those soils for thousands of years. And we had two basic types of vegetation in the Midwest. We had forests and we had prairie. This is another picture that a lot of you may have seen before, but in those yellow areas that you're seeing for Illinois, those are areas where we had prairie vegetation. And that was the case throughout the Midwest. Much of the Midwest was covered in prairie. For Illinois, and this illustration was made in the early 1800s, so there probably had been some substantial changes even by that point. But in the early 1800s, we still had about 20 million acres of land in Illinois under prairie. And so how did that prairie create organic matter? Well, you look at the above ground growth and you say, well, it probably came from that. Actually, very little of that above ground growth made it into the soil as organic matter. Where almost all of that organic matter came from was from the root systems of those prairie plants. Those prairie plants had very massive, fibrous root systems. Some of those plants, such as blazing star, the little plant that you see over on the far right-hand side here, the next to the farthest right, can go down 15 feet into the ground. Huge amounts of biomass, and they oozed organic matter. They were around for thousands and thousands of years after the last glacial episode ended. So they had a very long period of time to add organic matter into our soils. That is what created the organic matter in our soils today. Over on the left-hand side, you see the little red circle around there, and you're probably already guessing what that plant is. That's what we're growing in our lawns today with bluegrass. And you can see those root systems barely go down at all. So they're adding almost no organic matter into our soils. Another aspect that I wanted to mention is mycorrhizae. And there's been a lot of research being done with mycorrhizae. It's something that's been known for a long time, but there's a lot of research currently being done in it. As this is saying, it's the term mycorrhiza means fungus root. But basically what it is a type of fungus that works in conjunction with root systems. It acts kind of as an extension of that root system. It helps bring in water and nutrients, sugars and carbon from the soil. And in return, it receives water and nutrients from the plant. This has been going on probably since the beginning of beginning of plant system. So it's been going on for millions and millions of years. It's not something new. It's something that's just been part of nature. But it's also something that we're learning more and more about as time goes on. But this is a vital aspect of plant health. It's a vital aspect of soil health. Some of the benefits of this mycorrhizal fungi, besides the plant benefits, is it adds to the amount of organic matter that's accumulating in the soil because of the material that they give off. It helps retain those nutrients in the soil. And another really important part of mycorrhiza is when you pick up a piece of soil and you've got a little clump of soil between your fingers, that's not just one piece of soil. There are millions of individual soil particles in that little piece of soil. Did you ever wonder how those particles bind together? And this is something that was just discovered in the 1990s, but it's actually from that mycorrhizal fungi. They give off a substance that's kind of like a glue that helps bind soil particles together. So when we talk about soil structure, that crumb structure that you like to see in good garden soil or any type of soil, that's being created by that mycorrhizal fungi and that material that they're giving off. And there's actually a special name for that. For once, scientists came up with a name that kind of accurately describes what that material is. When that material makes soil particles glom together, that's the name they gave it, glomalin. Now, here's some examples of how this mycorrhiza works. There's two different types of mycorrhiza. One type that works mainly in, say, like prairie plants, garden plants, that just basically attach to the outside part of the root. And then the other type, which we're kind of showing an example of here, this works more for trees, where that mycorrhizal fungi will actually penetrate into the root system itself. But both are basically doing the same thing. They are acting as an extension of that root system. They're helping the plant. In return, the plant is helping that mycorrhiza. So it's a symbiotic relationship. Over on the right-hand side, you can actually see a photo of those spores being created outside of the root system on those mycorrhizal fungal strands. These are microscopic in size. You're not going to be able to see them in the soil. They're that small. Now, how would you tell whether you have a lot of mycorrhiza or a good mycorrhizal population in the soil or not?
On most models. However, if you have a cafe model, you must first select settings on the touchscreen.
Mute off. Please make sure you have your mute on, please. All right, so here's an example of what happens if you don't have a lot of mycorrhiza in the soil. This is a research plot where in some areas of the plot, they kept the soil fallow. So in other words, they continually tilled the soil. And when you till the soil, you're breaking up those fungal strands. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to totally destroy that mycorrhizal population, but obviously, if you're destroying those strands, it's going to take time for those strands to get regenerated and repopulate. Here's an example of what happens, and you can probably tell exactly in those areas where the tillage was done. You don't see tassels, do you? So when you do a lot of excessive tillage, what's happening is you're tearing up those mycorrhizal fungal strands, and so those plants are not getting that symbiotic relationship. They're not going to do as well. Here's a few garden plants that really benefit from having those mycorrhizal populations. So you can see bean, carrot, corn, cucumber, eggplant, garlic, herbs, melons, onion, peas, potatoes, raspberry, tomato. Lots of things we grow in the garden benefits from that mycorrhizal fungi that's out there. And the more tillage you do, the less of that mycorrhiza that's going to be present. So now we can talk a little bit about cover crops. You probably heard a lot about this with field crops, but we can also talk about this in gardens. Those cover crops help increase those mycorrhizal fungal populations. Those plants provide the polysaccharides, the sugars and the nutrients that the mycorrhiza needs. And then that mycorrhizal fungi gives off that glomalin as a byproduct, which creates that soil structure. That's another thing with excessive tillage. You're not only physically tearing up that structure, but then when you're decreasing the mycorrhizal populations, you're decreasing the ability of that soil to actually heal itself to create those new structures that have been destroyed. The other thing I want to say, I don't want to make this sound like gloom and doom. We're not totally destroying soils, but we are changing them. So what are some of the benefits of cover crops? Well, one of the first basic ones is if you've got residue on that soil for a longer period of time, you're naturally going to have less erosion, especially if you're in an area with slopes. And we've all seen in the last few years, and we've seen in different parts of Illinois, we've seen in different parts of the United States and other parts of the world this summer, some of these really massive rainfall events that have been happening. And we're getting more and more of these over the years. So the more residue you have on that soil for a longer period of time, when that raindrop hits that piece of residue, it takes the energy out of it. And so you're going to have less erosion occurring because of that. Another benefit of cover crops is it has shown that in some cases with certain types of cover crops, it can suppress perennial and winter annual weed growth. Now, the other thing I want to mention before I forget to say it is I am not an absolute expert on cover crops, but I'm trying to show you how it can be used in a garden setting. The other thing with cover crops is because it's got a root system there, and because it's got that helping that mycorrhizal fungi be present, it's going to help provide an addition of organic matter into the soil. And one of the other benefits of adding organic matter into the soil, if we look on the climate side of things, is organic matter is about 58% carbon. So the more organic matter you add into the soil, the more carbon you're adding into the soil. The other thing with organic matter is it also acts as a thermal regulator. So it helps take out those extremes in high and low temperatures in the soil also. There are a number of different types of cover crops that we could talk about. Some of the basic ones, these are ones that people will try because they're relatively easy to use. And some cover crops can be used where they just die out after the first frost. There are some cover crops that will overwinter, and then you have to terminate those cover crops before you start putting in your garden. So we'll talk a little bit about some of these, and two of these are actually overwintering crops. For tillage radishes, these are radishes not like your radishes that you grow to put in your lettuce salad. These are large radishes that grow very quickly. They're planted, actually, you could probably start planting them this time of year if you had some areas to do that. And plant them up until about the 10th of September, somewhere around there, but they grow very rapidly, and then they die out after the first couple of frosts. Cereal rye, I want to focus on cereal rye for this one. This is a very hardy overwintering cover crop. This is something throughout all of Illinois in the Midwest, you could plant rye even into late October. And it will germinate. It will, depending on where you're at in the state, it may not get up very tall, but it's very winter hardy, and it will start growing very rapidly in the spring. So obviously, this is one that you would have to terminate. And then the hairy vetch is also an overwintering crop, but it's also a legume, so it is something that can add nitrogen into the soil. Again, there are a number of other types of cover crops out there, and we'll talk more about that here in just a little bit. Here's an example of what a tillage radish looks like. Again, grows very, very rapidly and grows very deep. One of the benefits of tillage radish is if you have some surface compaction, it'll help bust that surface compaction up. Within just a few weeks or a couple months at most, it can get very deep and very tall. And then again, it will die out. And after it dies out, it decomposes very rapidly. So you can see these holes that are present after winter kill, but those holes will fill up, and by springtime, they won't even be noticeable. Rye, again, very hardy overwintering crop, grows very rapidly. This is something that if you're going to terminate it and you're going to use it as a cover crop or as a mulch layer, you want to wait until it's headed out, which in most of the state would be anywhere from late March to maybe mid-April. We'll show some pictures of that here in just a little bit as well. And then hairy vetch, again, something that works as a legume, helps add nitrogen into the crop or into the soil. And you can see it's very lush, but something also that has to be killed out. So the first demonstration that I want to talk about here, this is actually something that was a study that was done out in Maryland. where they tried to look at using several types of cover crops, not only in a green setting, but also talking about doing it organically and with no tillage. So this was a 5-year study that was done out there where they used plots of rye, hairy vetch, a combination of vetch and rye, and tillage radishes. And then along with that, a control area where they had no cover crop. They did that for 5 years and grew vegetables in these plots. So I wanted to show you some pictures associated with that and some of the results. When you're talking about those cover crops that overwinter and you have to terminate them, if you're going to do it organically, and if you're going to leave that material on the surface as residue, how do you do that? This is a piece of equipment called a crimper. Now, most people are not going to need something that size to lay this crop down. And essentially what this crimper does is it doesn't break the stem completely, but it lays that flat on the ground, lays the vegetation flat on the ground, but it bends the stem enough that it no longer allows water to move through the stem. So essentially those plants die out, but then they're flat on the ground. So you've got essentially a mulch layer there. This is a larger scale type of equipment. If you're looking at more of a garden setting, even a large size garden, you may want to have something a little bit mechanized like this. But for smaller gardens, what could you use that would maybe be useful? Well, we'll show, I thought I had that on the slide next, but I will show you a slide of what can be used here, just a few more slides. But what this is showing is, again, this is looking over the whole garden area that was put in. Again, we had areas of vetch, rye, a combination of vetch and rye, and then the tillage radishes, and then no cover crop. But in this area, this was crimped 2 weeks before this picture was taken. And you can already see the sweet corn starting to come up in there. And you can see that nice mulch layer there present. Now, will it stay that way forever? Probably not. This is about a month later. You can see the sweet corn coming up. Now, in the foreground, this is where the vetch and the rye and vetch combo areas are at. And you can see the weed control there is still pretty good, but it's not as good as, it's not as good in the just rye or obviously in the no cover crop area. So when those weeds come in, especially between the rows, what can be done for that? You can see it's getting even worse here. This is in a area with tomato plantings. It was a wet spring, but what they did was laid down 50-foot long, 4 feet wide, and of course this would be dependent on your row width, a weed barrier on either side of the tomato rows. Let them sit for a couple of weeks and then moved them to the next area. And how did that work? Well, here's an example. What you can see in the foreground is an area where that weed berry had been sitting for 2 weeks. They picked it up, moved it down to the area that you see where it's at now. And you can see it had basically fried any of those grasses and weeds that were present. And you've got that nice mulch layer that's going to continue to inhibit weed growth. Now, where you see the white areas, those are areas where the weed barrier has not been used at all. And you can see how tall that grass has gotten. With this picture that you're looking at now, this is 2 months after that weed barrier had been removed. And you can still see there's very, very good weed control in this. So essentially what's happening here, once you've got those first flush of weeds killed out, you have very little regrowth of weeds, as long as you've got that good mulch layer there. And as long as that's not disturbed to any great extent, and you can walk on this stuff, but as long as you don't create a lot of bare areas there, you've got an area where you have very little weed growth in between the rows. One of the things you would have to think about, though, is if you've got areas in between vegetables, whatever you're growing, you're probably going to have to do some hand pulling of weeds in the rows themselves. So this was looking at something on the East Coast. So I wanted to look and see if this would work in Illinois. So I did my own little field study site. This was done a few years ago down in Calhoun County. We work with a place called McCauley Heritage Farm, which had a small garden area. And I asked if we could do a field demonstration there, and they were kind enough to allow us to do that. And so what we did was we looked at just using tillage radish and cereal rye, which are pretty easy and simple things to start off with in terms of cover crops. And the thing I wanted to do was try to do what most gardeners would do. You're not going to go out and buy a bunch of equipment for this. You're going to use fairly simple types of seeding and weed control and all of those things. But after the initial cover crop seeding, we did no tillage. We did no pesticide use or herbicide use. So here's some examples of how that worked. So this is a picture of the site itself. So we had the garden tilled prior to seeding the cover crops. And you'll see here in a little bit some flags. So we divided this up into 2-foot swaths where we had alternating layers of cover crops where we put in tillage radish, combination of tillage radish and rye, and then just rye. And then control plots where we had no cover crop. How did we seed it? Well, we measured out how much seed we would need for the particular plot size. And since we had a freshly tilled field, I just hand seeded it, broadcast it within those plot areas. These seeds do not need a lot of soil coverage for them to grow. And we started with just the tillage radish at first. So this was done in early September. We had some good moisture during September. Here's what those tillage radishes look like by the end of September. As I said, they grow very, very rapidly. We seeded the rye in early October. This is just a couple of weeks afterwards. Now we do have a little bit of grass growing in there, but we do also have the rye coming up in there too. And you can see where the tillage radishes were seeded. The tillage radishes died out. It actually took about 2 frosts for them before they died out completely, but then we still had the rye. And come the following spring, this is what the rye looked like in late April of 2018. As you can see, it's headed out, and this for rye is the ideal time for crimping. You want to let it get to the point where it's headed out, because otherwise, if you try to do it before then, and you try to lay that rye down before it's headed out, a lot of it will pop back up. So you have to wait until this point to do this. So how did we do that? We're not going to use any big mechanical thing. We didn't have that big of an area. So I just fashioned this. I got some angle iron, got a 2x4, got some rope, put it together, and going to do this by hand. And that's what we did. Now, I will admit my leg was a little sore after doing this. And we had to go over it more than once in some areas to get it all flattened, but it did work. And here's what it looked like when we were done. So this could be done by hand if you wish to do it that way. In this plot for this particular year, we seeded potatoes. So we did have to disturb the soil just a little bit to put in the potatoes. But then, as they did out in the Maryland study, we used the weed barriers in between the rows. So you can see the potatoes growing there. You can see the weed barriers. One of the things that I did find, and you can see here, I was using the plastic ring stakes, made it much easier to pull these out as compared to the metal stakes. But the drawback with this is they do seem to work themselves out some. And if you get some storms with some strong winds, they will have a tendency to blow themselves out and blow the weed barrier off if you're not constantly, every few days checking those stakes to make sure that they're in place. So in one regard, the metal stakes would work better, but if you're planning on moving those stakes every 2 weeks, then you would probably be better off using those types of stakes. Where this is at was about an hour from my office, so I did not get down there every 2 to 3 weeks like I should have. But we did use these weed barriers, and after removing them, again, you can see how effective they were. They did kill out those weeds very easily. Now you look in the very front area, you can see a little bit of weeds there. That's kind of in between the rows. So again, in where the rows are at, you're going to have to do some hand pulling of weeds. But in between the rows, you've got that mulch layer there. And so it was very effective. This is something that I did want to add to this discussion. And the other thing I want to mention is, if you want to try this, are you always going to have that perfect result on the first year? Now, a lot of you that are out there gardening have probably tried to experiment with things, and you know that it's kind of a learning process. So you're not always going to have angels and butterflies over your head with this. It's something that you have to learn from. You find out what works, you find out what doesn't work. But if you want to keep at it, what this has kind of demonstrated is that it can be done if you wish to do this. The other aspect of it, though, in terms of soil health, is if you think you can just do a 1-year thing and you're going to have these big soil health benefits, that's probably not the case either. This is a study where they said they did 2 years of cover crops. In terms of soil health, didn't really see a big change in terms of soil microbiology, which probably is no big surprise. You think about all the years that those soils have been tilled, they've gone through a pretty massive change. And so it's not going to happen to get back to where it was overnight. And could you actually get it back to where it was 200 years ago? Probably not, even in a few decades. But you can start improving the soils and getting that organic matter up, getting that soil microbiology back, and getting that mycorrhizal fungi population up. And hopefully within about maybe 4 or 5 years, you can start seeing some visible benefits from this. Again, if you wish to do that. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of different cover crop options out there. And one of the best websites that you could go to find out different types of cover crops, different types of mixes, when to plant the cover crops for them to be useful, is a website called the Midwest. It's in the Midwest Cover Crops Council website, and it's called the Midwest Cover Crop Selector Tool. Now, if you look on here and you see the selector tools, all you see is row crop. But then if you look down at the bottom, they are constructing one for vegetable crops. And so hopefully in the near future, they will also have a tool that you could go in and use this for your vegetables as well. So I would keep that, do a search for Midwest Cover Crops Council, bookmark it, check it out, and hopefully here in the near future, they will have a tool on there for vegetable crops as well. So what you do in that, once you select the tool, and I'm sure it's going to be set up pretty much the same with vegetables as it is with field crops, but you can set a number of goals for what you're wanting to do. In this example, I just selected 3. There are probably at least a half a dozen or more different types of goals that you can set with. But for this one, I just put in lasting residue, soil builder, and weed fighter. And then you, then you get this. These are all available cover crops. Again, you can see when they can be planted. You can see when you can try to do it, but it's a little bit more risky. And then you can also see some of the how well these things work in terms of your goal fulfillment. So some of them are excellent. So in this example, for those 3 goals that I set, winter rye works really well, sorghum works well, sorghum Sudan grass and Sudan grass work very well as winter barley and some other things. But I would just keep tabs on this, and hopefully they will have that option available for vegetable crops in the very near future. And with that, short and sweet today, but I do thank you for listening. And I will now look at what questions we have. And we will get up to the beginning here. One of the first questions, I did not hear the explanation of minerals. Okay, so what minerals are just, again, these really tiny pieces. You might think of them as clay particles. And a lot of these are different types of minerals. A lot of these minerals are also plant nutrients. They can be taken up by plants. Okay, another question. Oh, yeah, it does look like we had some messaging issues, so hopefully that resolved itself. Do you have a recommended cover crop for an asparagus patch? Again, this is something where I don't have the expertise in for specifics, but I would really recommend keeping tabs on that Midwest Cover Crops Council website. Once they get that up, that'll be an excellent resource for very specific types of vegetables being grown. So in terms of purchasing seeds, there are a number of different sites out there. You can go online and find something. You want to find something obviously fairly close. There are several cover crop seed sources in Illinois. So you would want to check. I know there's one in Macomb, and I know there are other areas as well. But I would first visit with them, see what their prices are, see what's available, and go from there. They can also provide several different types of mixes if you want to try several different types of cover crops at once, or if you want just single seed sources, that's fine too. But again, you just need to check online because there are more available than I'm aware of throughout the state. Okay. Were the tillage radishes broadcast in the Calhoun County site? Yes, I just hand broadcast them. So they did not need working in, neither did the cereal rye. That was just soil surface applied. And as long as there's enough moisture, and there usually is at that time of year, they will come up. Now, in certain situations, especially if you're going into an area where it has not been tilled, you're probably going to have a little bit higher broadcast rates to make sure that you get enough seeding there to make it effective. Someone says those radishes are delicious. Okay, well, that's good. I would imagine they taste kind of like turnips. I haven't tried one myself, but that's what I'm imagining they probably taste like. So another question is, so what happens the next year after this initial crop and vegetable plantings? Well, you can go back in, do another cover crop, terminate that one in the spring. If you're doing an overwintering crop, just keep it going. You're going to have that surface residue there. It's going to build up slightly each year, hopefully. If you did it for 5 or 10 years, I'm not sure how big of a layer you would have, although it's continually getting decomposed. So unless it's massive, I don't think you're really going to have major issues with that mulch layer building up extensively, because it does decompose pretty rapidly throughout the spring, summer, and early fall. Where can you buy cover crop seeds or quantities for home garden? Again, I would just go online and do a search for cover crop garden seed and see what you come up with there. And if you have issues with finding them, you see my email address down at the bottom here. Feel free to email me and I will help you with that search. Would landscape cloth work instead of plastic? It might. The big thing with the black plastic is it really increases the heat underneath it. And so it really fries those plants, and it also generates enough heat that it kills out some of those weed seeds right on the very surface of the soil. So I think that's one of the benefits of the black plastic weed barrier. You could experiment with the landscape cloth. It would obviously keep the sunlight out for the most part for the plants. Whether it would generate enough heat underneath it to kill out the surface weed seeds, I'm not sure, but you could experiment with it and check it out. Please repeat the components of your foot crimper. Let me go back, and there it is. So we have some angle iron. We have a treated 2x4. If you didn't want to use a treated 2x4, that's fine. It's just going to wear out a little bit quicker. Some rope, and I used some eye bolts that just screwed into the board and attached the rope to it. At that time, when I did all that, I bought all of that at a local hardware store. It cost under 20 bucks. With today's prices, it's probably $100. I'm kidding. It's not going to be that much, but it's pretty inexpensive to do something like that. Again, if you're not looking for a large area, this works very easily. Okay, let's keep looking at questions here. Any recommendation for a community garden plot that plows in the fall and spring? So it plows both in the fall and the spring? Well, I guess one recommendation would maybe be not to till quite as much. You know, a lot depends too on what the goals are. For a community garden plot, you may not have enough volunteer help to do a cover crop setting. So it may not be feasible in that particular situation. And that's, again, one of the things that you have to think about is, you know, this is, especially at the beginning when you're kind of learning as you go, it's going to probably take a little bit of extra effort in some cases. So, you know, if you had a group of people that were willing to do that, yeah, it could work, but there may be some folks that I know if I did this at our family farm, if I would have done this back when I was a kid, my mom and dad would have had a fit with it. But over the years, I've also learned what that tillage, because we plowed it every spring. My dad went in, we had a large garden. My dad just took a tractor and a small plow in and just plowed the garden up every spring. That's what was done. But we also realize now what that tillage does to soil in terms of its overall health and quality over time. So it's really what some of your end goals are for that particular setting. What's the effect of cover crops on jumping worms? That is an excellent question. I don't know if there's been a lot of research that's been done on that, because jumping worms is a relatively new type of critter on the scene. I'll have to ask my entomologist colleague as soon as I get off of here, who's across the hall and see if he has any answers on that one. Would you recommend a cover crop for a raised bed? Yeah, I think that would work fine. Again, you're doing the same thing with it. And you're still going to have some benefits with that in terms of benefiting that mycorrhizal fungi that's going to be present. So yes, I think it could work in a raised bed as well as in a regular garden setting. What does headed out mean? Okay, let me go back and show. So at the, whoops, you can see in this case, see the little seed heads on top of the rye. So that's what we're talking about. The seed heads have come out. So that's what headed out means. And that's the ideal time to do this, because if you do it before that seed head is out, then that plant is more likely to pop back up. You don't want to wait until it starts to die out, because at that point, then you're going to have probably some viable rye seed in there, and then you're going to have to contend with rye seed growing up. Okay. We buy a bag from the same people that supply farmers with seed and then divide it with several master gardeners. Yep, that's a fine way of doing that. Okay, in Champaign, I bought ryegrass at seed at Prairie Gardens. What is the metal part of the crimper called? That's angle iron. And you can find that in any hardware store. Pretty inexpensive. This is true. Cover crimpers are also useful for making crop circles, probably its very first use. Here's somebody, I bought some sorghum and buckwheat at www.seedworldusa.com. Johnny Seed sells a few cover crop mixes that are not too bad priced, £1/4 pound to 50 pounds. Okay. Here's talking about asparagus beds need a 4 to 5 inch layer of leaves in the fall. This will stop weeds and retain moisture. So again, you're using that as a mulch layer. That's good. Leaves are free. Yep. Okay. Are there any other questions? I think that runs through the questions that we have in the chat box. Well, if not, again, I thank you for attending today. We will have this probably available on YouTube within 3 to 4 weeks, I'm guessing, once we send it into our communications team and they get it all closed captioned and up on our YouTube channel. And we will send out a notice to everyone when that is available. We actually had well over 300 register for this, and as time goes on, we're finding out more and more, just waiting for the recording, which is perfectly fine. But I do appreciate you being on today, and I appreciate your questions. And as a favor, if you wouldn't mind going ahead and doing this post-webinar survey, you can see the address there at go.illinois.edu/cc survey, or you can scan the QR code. If you can take a moment and fill out that survey, it'd be much appreciated. Again, if you have any questions at any time, feel free to email me at the address below, friend@illinois.edu. And with that, I will wish you a good afternoon and hope to see you again sometime. Take care. Bye.